faces sentencing in his bribery case, and a look at profiling by U.S. law enforcement officials. Later, Energy Secretary Samuel Bodman on dependency on foreign oil, and then we'll hear from the president of OPEC. On C-SPAN 2, a live Pentagon briefing from Iraq at 9 Eastern, and the Senate returns to continue work on a low-income heating assistance bill. On C-SPAN 3, a former U.S. ambassador joins a discussion on the Middle East. Then former White House Press Secretary Joe Lockhart and Time Magazine's Washington bureau chief talk about covering the president. And a speech on the economic outlook from a member of the Federal Reserve Board. Now a House committee considers U.S. policy towards the Palestinians in view of January's election victory by the Islamic Hamas Party. State Department officials go before the House International Relations Committee, chaired by Henry Hyde. This is about 2 hours and 25 minutes.
The committee will come to order. Before we begin our proceedings this morning, I'd like to pay tribute to the American Foreign Service officer and the Pakistani employee of our mission who was driving him, who were killed today in Karachi, Pakistan, in an obvious attempt to intimidate the President of the United States. We also pay tribute to the Pakistani security officials who are accompanying our employees and were killed or injured while protecting these individuals. Neither the President nor our nation will be intimidated by this terrorist attack. The names of the victims have not yet been released. Since we have senior officials of the administration present, I would like to take this opportunity to extend through you our condolences to your colleagues at the Department of State and to express our continuing support for the efforts to protect those who represent our nation overseas.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Lantos.
On our side, we want to endorse and fully support your statement on this matter.
Thank you. On January 25, 2006, Palestinians turned out in large numbers to elect a new legislative council. The unsettling result was a decisive win by Hamas, which had previously been declared a terrorist organization by the United States and which remains formally committed to the destruction of Israel. There's no shortage of analyses offered to explain this upset. Many observers stress that the elections took place during a time of growing discontent among the Palestinian population across a range of issues, including widespread frustration with the Palestinian Authority for having made insufficient progress toward achieving statehood. In addition, the powers that be, most prominently the dominant Palestinian organization Fatah, were increasingly factionalized and commonly perceived as thoroughly corrupt. Regardless of the reasons, and as disappointed as many are by the election results, the Palestinian people deserve recognition for having conducted what were arguably the freest and fairest democratic elections in the Arab world. As Secretary Rice stated in Davos last month, quote, "The Palestinian people have apparently voted for change, but we believe that their aspirations for peace and a peaceful life remain unchanged." But the victory by Hamas has presented the United States with a dilemma. If Hamas remains committed to Israel's destruction, it will be impossible for the Palestinian Authority to be a credible negotiating partner. But given that there is no candidate waiting to fill that role, the always precarious search for some version of peace in the region cannot move forward. The key question then is whether or not Hamas can be persuaded to change its rejection of Israel's right to exist and to accept that the fundamental interests of the Palestinian people can only be met, if not by peace, then by a working accommodation between the two sides. What leverage do the United States, the Israelis, the Europeans, the moderate Arab leaders, and other members of the international community possess to assist this process? The most obvious instrument is financial support. Over many decades, the United States has been generous in helping to meet the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people, with its donations amounting to nearly $2 billion over the years. But most of that assistance has been provided indirectly through the United Nations and other international organizations. We've given little direct aid to the Palestinian Authority itself, and that is unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. Further, following Hamas's victory, the House and Senate agreed on a resolution stating that the United States should not give direct aid to the Authority as long as its legislature remains dominated by those who call for the destruction of Israel. But a cutoff of funding for humanitarian programs would have the effect of helping terrorist regimes like Syria and Iran expand their support among the Palestinian population. Without question, continued assistance from the U.S. and other donors is essential to meeting basic human needs and avoiding a worsening of conditions in general. According to the World Bank, unemployment in the West Bank and Gaza is an astonishing 23%, but the real level may be as much as twice that amount. 43% of the population is living below the poverty line. Who can doubt that these are ingredients for continued instability and ultimately an explosion? The administration has informed our committee that it's reviewing all forms of assistance to the Palestinians. I'm certain our witnesses today will enlighten us on this and other issues, including our discussions with the Israeli government and others in the region and in the international community. In the book of Isaiah is found the oft-quoted phrase, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." This vision has remained beyond reach ever since these words were written, more than 2 millennia ago, and yet it remains an enduring element in our ambitions for the future. But the world's billions dream different dreams, and we cannot expect noble sentiments alone to conquer irreconcilable differences and end deadly struggles. Some problems have no identifiable solution, but the baser instincts of man can be pressed into service for ends beyond those of immediate contests. Self-interest can be harnessed to advance common goals, and even fiercely defended separations can become stable boundaries. Even as we must confront reality on its unyielding terms, we must hope that others understand that the virtues of self-interest need not be narrowly confined. I hope the leaders of Hamas will combine their new mandate with wisdom and compassion for their own people and avoid the exhilarating temptations of apocalyptic visions, for these can only add to the suffering, desolation, and hopelessness they have long reigned among the people for whom they have sought and now have been given inescapable responsibility. Let me now turn to my friend, the ranking Democratic member, Mr. Lantos, for any opening remarks he may wish to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This hearing could not be more timely, since the officially designated terrorist organization, Hamas, will form its cabinet sometime this month. It is bizarre that some governments are still deciding how to respond to this political farce. So there could be no better time to remind everyone of what is at stake. Here is a salient quote from the Charter of Hamas. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it, end quote. Mr. Chairman, this hate-filled screed, the Hamas Charter, takes venom to new levels. It indicates that giving an inch of ground, literally or figuratively, is tantamount to renouncing Islam. And Hamas leaders have not changed their rhetoric one iota since winning the election. Far from it. Hamas leaders are now holding out their hands and asking U.S. taxpayers to continue the flow of dollars. But the blood of dozens of Americans and hundreds of Israeli men, women, and children is on those hands. It has long been U.S. policy not to support terrorists in any way. We must make absolutely clear that we will not deal with the terrorist thugs who now lead the Palestinian Authority. Not a single penny of U.S. taxpayer money should end up in Hamas coffers. My good friend, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, and I have introduced legislation, H.R. 4681, that turned this basic principle into law. I also want to make it clear that simply ending direct assistance to the Palestinian Authority doesn't cut it. There must be an end to all non-humanitarian assistance that could benefit Hamas. The last thing in the world we in Congress want to do is to let a Hamas government reap the credit for development projects that are funded by the American taxpayer. Of course, I support the continuation of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians. But we must be clear about how we define such aid. The phrase humanitarian assistance means just what it says, and it is clearly defined in our legislation: food, water, and medicine. The United States must respond to this new situation with honor and integrity. No negotiations, no contact, no assistance beyond humanitarian aid. We have a standard that this country has long maintained. We have a statute now in the works, and we have an example to set in the eyes of the world. And we should make clear to all, Mr. Chairman, that we strongly oppose their hosting or meeting with Hamas. I am deeply disappointed by the Turkish and Russian decisions to host Hamas. The words and deeds of this gang of terrorist thugs put them beyond the pale of organizations that governments should deal with. And the fact that these invitations have come from two countries with their own terrorist problems, countries that stridently demand that nobody meet with the terrorist groups that threaten them, is sickening hypocrisy. Mr. Chairman, let me briefly turn to a matter of critical national security that is directly within our witnesses' purview: the pending transfer of the management of 6 key American ports to a company owned by the government of Dubai, a part of the United Arab Emirates. 5 years ago, the UAE governments looked the other way as their citizens helped plan and execute the September 11 attacks on the United States. Financing for the attacks was arranged through their banks, and 2 of the hijackers were their citizens. They have held telethons for terrorists. Mr. Chairman, the government officials who were in charge 5 years ago are still in power today. Yet, without any consultation with Congress, the administration cleared the sale of the uniquely sensitive management of 6 major United States ports to Dubai Ports World, a company owned and controlled by that government. While some have breathed a sigh of relief that there is now a 45-day review of the deal, I am totally unimpressed. This deal is being concluded today. Does anyone really believe that the review will reverse that? It is a bureaucratic fiction, a fig leaf for the appalling truth. We will know how bad this deal was only when it is too late. In addition to the security concerns, Mr. Chairman, it is simply outrageous that we would turn over management of ports to a company that, by their own admission, actively participates in the Arab League boycott of Israel, our ally and the only democracy in the Middle East. American firms are prohibited from complying with the boycott. Yet now the administration seems willing to turn over our critical ports to governments that actively discriminate. Mr. Chairman, the foreign policy and national security implications of the Dubai Ports World deal are staggering. I therefore respectfully and formally request that our committee schedule a hearing on this important subject in the immediate future, leading to legislation that will prevent such lunacy once and for all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Normally, the proceeding is 1 minute for each member to unburden him or herself of whatever they can in 1 minute, but that is to make available to as wide a group of members some time at the microphone. I'm being pressured by 2 members to increase that to 2 minutes. I'm going to do that, but I'm going to suggest that we have votes about 11:30, I'm told, and we just take away at one end what we give at the other end. So let's try to hold it to 2 minutes. There is no law that says you have to ask a question at this period in the hearing. So I'll leave it to your good judgment. We also call members in the order in which they appear in the committee room rather than by alphabetic order or some other format. So let's first go to Mr. Lantos. You have 2 minutes, sir.
I yield my 2 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you. Mr. Leach.
I yield.
I thank you. Mr. Berman.
Mr. Berman reserves his time.
Mr. Smith of New Jersey.
I'll be very brief, Mr. Chairman. When the terrorist organization Hamas gained 74 of the 132 seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council, it underscored a concern that I've had for some time, that free and fair elections are not ends in and of themselves, but are only one of the pillars in the quest for democracy and respect for fundamental human rights. Clearly, and Hamas's victory takes this beyond theory, free and fair elections can usher into power brutal dictatorships with a seemingly popular mandate. The rule of law, not just any law, but the rule of just law, is indispensable to the creation of any sane and compassionate society. This hearing, and I'm very happy that you've scheduled this, Mr. Chairman, is extremely timely as Congress faces the challenge of earnestly desiring to tangibly assist the Palestinian people, especially its vulnerable children, as well as advancing a durable peace process while not enabling an organization that has long hated Jews and refused to accept Israel's right to exist. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ackerman of New York.
The Palestinian elections have created a new reality in the Middle East, a Palestinian Authority led by Hamas. We all know Hamas is a pack of bloodthirsty killers. We know that their stated intent is to destroy Israel. We know that two states living side by side in peace and security is not their goal. So it strikes me as odd, Mr. Chairman, that when faced with this reality, too many people are asking the wrong question. The question is not, how can we fix this? The question must be, how can we make them fail? It is sheer folly to proceed from an assumption that Hamas will abandon its core beliefs now that they're engaged in the electoral process. Does the mantle of an election necessitate our finding some way to appease them? Do we really have to agree because they garnered a majority? Is it really incumbent upon us to brush aside their loathsome ideology and the pile of corpses that they've created as if it no longer mattered? I've heard the suggestions that we could provide assistance through Abu Mazen's office, that with enough legal hair-splitting and spin-doctoring, we could continue business as usual without involving Hamas. That is ridiculous. We should have been assisting Abu Mazen a year ago when such assistance would have made a difference, a point that I made repeatedly after his election. Now that is too late. The idea that we can put a mask on a monster and then deal with the monster must be abandoned. For the sake of our overarching interests in the Middle East and the global war on terror, for the sake of any hope of peace, we must affirmatively seek the failure of Hamas. Promotion of democracy does not bind us to whomever is elected. The Palestinian people made a choice. They elected terrorists to govern them, to represent them, and to speak for them. Now we have a choice to make. Will we acquiesce in the elevation of a radical Islamist terrorist organization as an international partner, or will we stand fast? Tacit acceptance, grudging acceptance, partial acceptance are all acceptance, and allowing any would be our failure. Let me suggest that if Hamas can withstand the demands of the whole world, then the world's single superpower ought to be able to muster the will and insist that the blood-soaked terrorists are not partners for peace, that they are not negotiating partners, and that they are not aid recipients, and that they will not be absolved
The
for the
gentleman's
hundreds they have
time
killed.
has expired.
I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to put the rest of my statement in the record, and I'm very sorry that the Chairman saw fit to usurp the subcommittee's scheduled hearing on this so that the distinguished Chair and Ranking Member and all the members of the subcommittee could have had the full ability to express their opinions.
Ms. Ross-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It has been long-standing U.S. policy to bring both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the negotiation table and work toward a peaceful compromise. However, to achieve peace and security, Israel must have a legitimate partner on the Palestinian side who seeks the same goal, rather than calling for Israel's destruction and death to the Jews. A Hamas-controlled Palestinian Authority is an enormous threat to U.S. strategies to ensure regional stability, to counter terrorism, and to promote tolerance and true democratic reform. The President and the Congress have been clear on the conditions that must be met for U.S. assistance to be provided to the PA in its entirety. The Hamas-led PA must renounce terrorism, must disarm extremists, recognize Israel as an independent, democratic, sovereign Jewish state, and commit to prior commitments by the PA. I sincerely hope that we do not waver from these commitments. I would appreciate it if in their testimony the panelists would address news reports saying that the administration has significantly eased its opposition to Hamas and that the State Department has established guidelines to ensure continued U.S. financial and other support to a Hamas-controlled PA. The EU, as we know, decided to continue to fund a PA government led by Hamas without first demanding that they change their charter and abandon terrorism. A senior Hamas leader expressed his satisfaction with the fact that EU reversed its position regarding the freezing of funds, quote, without Hamas having to make any concessions or yield to pressures, end quote. U.S. policy must be different than the EU. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Berman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I just came back from the Middle East. I had the opportunity briefly to speak with Ambassador Welsh and General Dayton, and appreciate very much the work they're doing. Just two quick points. One to my friend, the chair of the subcommittee. I don't understand the EU decision to have been as you described. There is a difference of opinion about during this interim period before the government is formed, whether assistance should continue to the Palestinian Authority. The EU position is that assistance should be provided. I do not understand that the decision they made that was announced was a decision to fund to continue assistance to the Palestinian Authority at the point where Hamas forms the government. If it is such a decision, then it is a serious, serious blow, because you are absolutely right. They have in no way done anything to meet the three requirements. And I think it's very important for us to remember not to let the wish govern the thought. Even from that Washington Post interview, which was later renounced by the person designated to be the prime minister under this authority, there is no indication whatsoever that Hamas is prepared to meet the three conditions, or is willing to, or is even seriously entertaining that fact. And we shouldn't let our hope that things can go normally and that the zebra can change its stripes, and that a good governance and a government that's prepared to live in coexistence with and recognize the legitimacy and the right to exist of the State of Israel is coming into place, because there is no evidence that that is the case. And therefore, the assistance which Israelis, Americans, and hopefully Europeans and others believe should continue on a humanitarian basis, not to the Palestinian Authority, that assistance, and it's very important, is definitely not intended to be assistance to the PA.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Tancredo of Colorado.
Nothing, sir.
Mr. Delahunt of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll just take the time to pose a question that I hope will be answered during the course of your testimony. And it's a point I think that was implicit in the statement of the ranking member, Mr. Lantos. I'd like to hear from either the ambassador or from General Dayton the support coming from the United Arab Emirates for Hamas, and do you anticipate that that support will continue from the United Arab Emirates for Hamas if in fact it exists? And I yield back.
Mr. Poe of Texas.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one brief point to make, and that is that foreign interventionism, the policy that we follow in this country, always has unintended consequences, and this quandary we face in Palestine right now is a perfect example of how we help to create these problems. Not too many years ago, both Israel and the United States helped create and encourage Hamas, and yet now that has come back to haunt us. And that's not unlike our token type of alliance and help to Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein in the past. But then we spend a lot of lives and a lot of money promoting the principles of democracy, and then we even use some of our money to try to influence elections around the world, including the one in Palestine. And when it doesn't go our way, then we go back to forming an attempt to form another group similar to Hamas to counterbalance Hamas, just as we did to counterbalance the Arafat and PLO. I would suggest that there's too many unintended consequences of foreign interventionism, and worst of all, we lose credibility. What we're doing over there now tends to make us look badly with almost every Arab Muslim nation. So I still argue the case for non-intervention, which is a tradition that the American people followed and our country followed for a long time. It's too bad we don't give it serious consideration today, and I yield back.
Ms. Watson of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks that you made about the death of the embassy officer. Protection of our embassies is a top priority with me, as protection of our ports. I think it's foolhardy to put the ownership of and management of any port in the hands of a foreign nation regardless. And I think we need to do more oversight in this committee of our foreign policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Palestinian elections held just over a month ago have great potential to aggravate the tense situation in the Middle East. Hamas, under the banner of change and reform, did win a majority of the seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. This is the same Hamas that has been designated a foreign terrorist organization by the State Department of the United States. It's now in a position to negotiate as a so-called bona fide player in the Middle East. Hamas's steadfast refusal to disarm, their saber-rattling, and their insistence on the destruction of Israel is a penetrating siren of warning to all nations that value true freedom and democracy. They must prove their desire to reform by renouncing terror and recognizing Israel's absolute right to exist. No rhetoric, just results. Hamas should not receive any money, not a dime, from the United States or our allies till we see some proof. Otherwise, the money we send to Hamas may become blood money for terrorists. Mr. Chairman, there should be no tribute for terrorists or terrorist nations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Sherman of California.
The Hamas platform explicitly calls for ethnically cleansing the entire Middle East of 5 million Israelis. It implicitly calls for their genocide. The fact that the Palestinians voted for Hamas is not a reason to view Hamas as benign, but rather to acknowledge that the Palestinians voted for malignancy. I join with Mr. Lantos and so many others in saying that we should give nothing to a Hamas-led government, no matter what face is put in front of it, and that we should limit all of our aid to the Palestinians to humanitarian aid. I'd go further and say even that humanitarian aid should be very limited. Any aid helps Hamas politically. And every dollar we give to the Palestinian humanitarian aid is a dollar we've taken away from child survival, AIDS, malaria, Darfur, Congo, earthquake and flood victims around the world. Finally, I join with Mr. Lantos in calling for hearings of this committee to deal with the port situation because of the direct connection. Just a few months ago, Hamas posted a press release praising the UAE for its generous aid to that terrorist organization. The response of the UAE was to bask in the glory of being praised by Hamas. So much money has been raised in the UAE for Hamas with the full support of the leaders of that government. The president of the UAE serves on the board of a charity which funds dollars to Hamas and other terrorist organizations. I'm not sure these folks ought to be running our ports. I look forward to hearings and hopefully a markup. I yield back.
Mr. Barrett of South Carolina. Thank you. Mr. Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To those who say, well, this was a free and democratic election, I say with choices in elections, there are consequences. And just because the Palestinian people voted for Hamas does not mean that we should just go merrily along and pretend that everything is fine. Everyone mentions, and it's only fair and just, that until Hamas renounces terrorism, recognizes Israel's right to exist, and abides by all previous agreements that were signed by the Palestinians, there should be no aid to Hamas. I'm very much chagrined when Russia and some of the European nations, typically not having any spines or backbones, once again are showing that they are looking to sort of cut corners and finesse the situation. There ought to be pressure on Hamas until they understand that there are, again, consequences. And I believe that this committee, again, should, as was mentioned in the past, have many hearings, many oversight hearings on this issue, on the ports issue, on all these issues, because, again, as my colleague Mr. Sherman said, it's all connected. I had the occasion to meet with Mr. Abbas, with Senator Obama before the elections, and it occurred to me that Mr. Abbas is may be well-meaning, but the moderates there need to really grab the bull by the horns. You know, in some ways, there's a silver lining in everything. I don't want to see a coalition government, frankly, with the Palestinians, because this will give Hamas a way to hide. It'll give Hamas a way to finesse the situation. It'll give the government a way to somehow try to pretend that they can continue business as usual with Israel and with the United States and with the West, and Hamas, therefore, would not have to change any of its positions.
The gentleman's time has
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just finish by saying pressure needs to be put on Hamas to change its positions, or there will be consequences, and the pressure has got to come from the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, in order to get to the witnesses more quickly, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Lee of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. Hamas must renounce violence. By renouncing violence and recognizing Israel, Hamas can bring the Palestinian Authority into stronger negotiations in terms of their position to achieve its ambitions of sovereignty, self-government, and the Palestinian state. The democratic election of Hamas, of course, is far from ideal, but it's also precisely the time for the United States to aggressively pursue the roadmap and to encourage all parties to resume negotiations. I believe that these negotiations should encourage the Palestinian Authority, require the Palestinian Authority to reiterate its commitment to Israel's right to exist, and also to the processes and to the outcomes that are envisioned in the roadmap. The stability and security of both the Palestinian and Israeli people depend upon continued engagement. And I believe that we have a duty as the United States of America, as a country that's trying to work toward peace and security in the Middle East, we really have a responsibility to ensure that the continued engagement increase, so that tensions not be allowed to give rise to further chaos and to further violence. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson of South Carolina. Ms. Berkeley of Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us. While the Palestinian people took a historic step towards voting out the old guard and the remnants of Yasser Arafat's corrupt political machine, they unfortunately took 2 steps back in electing Hamas to a majority in the Palestinian legislature. Palestinian legislature ruled by Hamas, in my opinion, threatens the peace and stability of the entire Middle East. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's killed more than 500 people since 1989, including 24 U.S. citizens. Its involvement in the political process has not altered its stated goal of destroying Israel. Electing Hamas is the equivalent of electing the Taliban or al-Qaeda to govern the Palestinian territories. Hamas must disavow its stated goal of destroying Israel and change its charter to recognize Israel's right to exist as a free and independent Jewish state. If these reforms are not made immediately and carried out with conviction, Hamas should not be recognized as a legitimate party in the democratic process. And until Hamas disarms, renounces violence, and recognizes Israel's right to exist, it is my opinion we should end all U.S. aid to the Palestinians. I am also opposed to any humanitarian aid. One of the low points in our relations with our so-called Arab allies was when Secretary of State Condi Rice was in the Middle East recently, standing next to the Egyptian representative, who looked at her, and after her requesting that they do not support Hamas with aid, said that they were going to do it anyway. And then and this is a country that we give $2 billion worth of aid to, spit in our faces. The Saudis, who are the largest exporters of terrorism and the largest financiers of terrorists throughout the world.
The gentle lady's time has expired. Mr. Meeks of New York.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll be brief. It seems clear. The ball is in Hamas's court. There's three things they have to do. It's just that simple. Renounce violence. The absolute right and recognition of Israel to exist. And accept and honor all prior agreements, as any sovereign nation would be. We in the United States, if there's no matter what president was here and another administration took over, we've got to honor agreements. But the ball is in their court. We should not and cannot fund Hamas or send money over there until we know that they accept the terms of the agreement. Just that plain and simple. I yield back.
Mr. Schiff of California.
The rejection of the corruption of Fatah, and that I think is what happened in the Palestinian elections, has to be a lesson for us with respect to other regimes in the region and what might follow the collapse of those regimes. We cannot support Hamas government. We just can't. And I have no confidence in anything but the longest of terms that Hamas will change. And our unwillingness to support Hamas is not a rejection of democracy or the democratic process, but the fact that Palestinians chose a terror organization to be their new governing party doesn't require the international community, it doesn't require the United States to support that terrorist organization or its government. Elections do have consequences, and I think we need to use all the instruments of our diplomacy to provide a united front to cut off Hamas from financial assistance, and that includes nations in the region, particularly nations that receive large amounts of American assistance, nations that have recognized Israel's right to exist, cannot be allowed the duplicity of saying we have treaties and agreements to recognize Israel's right to exist, but we also support financially those that are determined to wipe Israel off the map. And I look forward to hearing from you how we intend to use those diplomatic instruments and what we can do here in the Congress to assist in that effort. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Carnahan of Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With the electoral victory of a known terrorist organization whose own charter calls for the destruction of Israel, it is obviously a setback in the peace process in the Middle East. We now find ourselves in an interesting situation. Our country pushed for free and fair elections, but now we're faced with the reality that a terrorist organization has won those elections. The axiom that elections have consequences is particularly appropriate in this situation. Hamas continues to reiterate their commitment to the destruction of Israel. Therefore, we cannot and should not support any organization that has such a position. Both the U.S. and the European Union recognize Hamas as a foreign terrorist organization. Both the U.S. and the EU have provided hundreds of millions of dollars in development aid to the PA over the last several years. Should this financial support continue,
Much of the money could flow into the coffers of Hamas without any oversight of the U.S. or the international community. The obvious conclusion that we can all draw from this is that U.S. and EU development aid will end up being used by Hamas to carry out terrorism-related activities both against Israel and elsewhere. We must also deal with the fact that a nuclear Iran is a direct ally of Hamas. While the implications of a nuclear Iran are far-reaching, its impact in Hamas has the ability to be seen far and wide. We need to concentrate on steps that both the U.S. and our allies around the world can take to prevent Iran from gaining further influence in Hamas. I look forward to hearing your testimony here today, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fortenberry of Nebraska.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today to examine U.S. policy toward Palestinians at this watershed moment for the Middle East, and I appreciate the witnesses joining us today. The Quartet of Nations has been unambiguous in its call for Hamas to renounce violence and its goal to destroy Israel. The United States has also been unambiguous on the position that providing U.S. government assistance to any entity that has the goal of the destruction of Israel is unthinkable. Yet Hamas appears intransigent as the world looks on, and Iran seeks to use this opportunity to extend its influence in the region as well. While it is clear that the Palestinian people voted for change and government accountability, it is also clear that a majority of them favor the restoration of the peace process galvanized by the Oslo Accords. In assessing U.S. policy in view of Hamas's success in the recent Palestinian elections, I believe that we must be careful not to isolate voices of moderation and play into the hands of those who would promote and extol terror. In the interest of our national security, the ultimate aim of U.S. Middle East policy is to seek a just outcome for people who thirst for peace and a better life. We need to be very thoughtful and deliberate as we contemplate the best means to achieve this outcome, maintaining the flexibility to communicate with Palestinians who share our commitment to peace and who have worked to promote a constructive Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. I'm keenly interested in your testimony and hearing your perspectives today on the possible parameters of our potential engagement with such Palestinians, as well as our efforts to assist the development of civil society and to mobilize an international consensus that facilitates the Palestinian full and unconditional renewal of its current international commitments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. And last, Mr. Wexler of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe much of what needs to be said has been said. I would just like to take maybe a small different tack for a moment. I believe Ambassador Mark Ott is in the room. Mr. Ott serves as the EU envoy to the Middle East. I acknowledge his presence for two reasons. One, because he's a gentleman of high standing and very significant caliber, but also because I think there are two models of leadership that we have seen employed, the Iraq model and the Iran model. The Iraq model, where America led, and we had a division with Europe and a division within Europe, and the Iran model, where the United States and Europe have essentially worked together. And I think all of us, in the pursuit of what we believe is America's interest, would prefer the Iran model of leadership for America as it applies particularly to Hamas. And I say this in the hope that if we are to successfully defend the principles that were enunciated by the Quartet, it is going to require that both Europe and the United States work together in concert to isolate those that refuse to acknowledge the principles so artfully outlined by the Quartet. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me that time.
Thank you, Mr. Wexler. C. David Welch was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs on March 18, 2005. Prior to his appointment, he served as the American ambassador to the Arab Republic of Egypt from 2001 to 2005. A career Foreign Service officer, Ambassador Welsh has served in key positions in the Middle East. Mr. James Kunder is an assistant administrator of the Bureau for Asia and the Near East at the U.S. Agency for International Development. From July 2002 to 2004, he served as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Asia and the Near East. Mr. Kunder has extensive governmental and private sector experience in assistance and international development. Lieutenant General Keith W. Dayton has served as United States Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority since December 2005. Most of his time has been spent operating from the region. Prior to his current position, General Dayton served as Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy in the Office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for the United States Army. Ambassador Welch, please proceed with a 5-minute summary of your testimony. Your full statement will be made a part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you also for your kind and respectful words for our colleagues in Karachi, Pakistan. I appreciate the opportunity to work with this committee, and on behalf of those of us who work in this particular area of the world, the Near East, and of course our colleagues in South Asia, I'm grateful that you recognize the contribution of all of us. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to come before this committee at this important time. Although a great deal has transpired in the course of my first year as Assistant Secretary, as you have, I am going to focus my remarks today on the last 2 months, a time of important changes in the Israeli-Palestinian area. On the 25th of January, the Palestinians voted in Legislative Council elections, the first parliamentary vote in 10 years. These elections were free and fair, characterized by good security and high voter turnout, and they reflect the growing trend towards more democratic opportunity throughout the Middle East. As you know, our commitment to democracy is not measured by the achievement of a particular electoral result. Democracy is not always a process that produces outcomes that are in accordance with our desires. Hamas won a victory over Fatah in the Palestinian elections, and in light of that victory, we have to grapple with some difficult questions about the future of our relationship with the Palestinian Authority, the likelihood of a terrorist group in the Palestinian government, and our assistance programs in the Palestinian territories. Let me say at the outset that our commitment to the security of Israel remains unshakable. We continue to consult closely with our ally and friend on ways forward in light of these developments. During my meetings with Israeli officials as recently as this past weekend, I found that we largely share goals and concerns. In the broader international context, together with our quartet partners, we have outlined a strategy that's based on principle and pragmatism. It was U.S. leadership that led to the January 30th Quartet statement that expressed our belief that the Palestinian people have the right to expect a new government to address their aspirations for peace and statehood. With governing comes responsibility. We stated that any future assistance to any Palestinian government will be reviewed against that government's commitment to 3 principles: abandonment of terror and violence, recognition of Israel, and acceptance of previous agreements and obligations. It is not possible to pursue a peaceful life of your people, for your people while you engage in terrorism, nor is it possible to make peace with a country whose very existence whose very right to exist you deny. Thus, we have placed the onus squarely on Hamas. Hamas will now have to bear responsibility for the decisions it makes and face up to the consequences of those decisions, which will shape the international community's approach to issues involving the Palestinians and regional peacemaking efforts. Until a new government is formed, we are cooperating with the international community to facilitate the work of the caretaker government. In the last month, we have worked with Arab governments and the international communities to stabilize the finances of the Palestinian Authority until a new government takes over. In December, Saudi Arabia and Qatar pledged additional support for the PA, and more recently, Russia has done so. We continue to maintain close contacts with President Abbas and Acting Finance Minister Jihad al-Wazir to maintain the financial viability of this caretaker government. The Hamas victory has necessitated a thorough interagency review of our assistance program for the Palestinians, which is diverse. As this committee knows, most assistance has been provided directly to the Palestinian people through NGOs and contractors. Our review encompasses each and every U.S. government assistance effort involving the Palestinians, and includes any assistance provided to the Palestinian Authority itself. The work of this review is well advanced, and we expect to be able to recommend ways forward to our senior leadership in the days to come and to receive their guidance. I can say that as part of that effort, we have already requested, and the Palestinian Authority has agreed, to return the unexpended balance, which we calculate to be in the excess of $45 million of funding provided last year for infrastructure projects in Gaza. This is the $50 million set aside. Let me briefly outline principles that are guiding this review. First, we have not, we do not, and we will not provide assistance to Hamas, in government or out of government. Second, because it serves important U.S. national interests, we are looking for ways to continue to help the Palestinian people, particularly through provision of assistance to help meet basic humanitarian needs. Third, our policy will be logical and consistent in order to both send a clear signal to the Palestinians of our expectations and also to secure the support and emulation of an international donor community which provides considerable Palestinian aid. Finally, we will ensure close consultation with the Congress, and of course this committee in particular, as well as with key friends in the region as our review is completed. We've encouraged our neighbors in the international community to similarly review their assistance efforts based upon the principles set forth by the Quartet. The international community has a critical role to play as we move forward, and we are working to ensure that Hamas receives a consistent message that it must commit to the principles of ending violence and terror, recognizing Israel, and accepting previous agreements. It's important to remember that the Palestinian people's aspirations to live in peace remain strong. Although Hamas won a majority of the seats in the PLC, it won those seats on the basis of a narrow plurality of votes. Hamas was able to turn that narrow plurality of popular votes into a larger number of seats due to superior organization during the election and idiosyncrasies of the block voting system for a portion of the seats in the elections. Opinion polls and analysis of the balloting suggest the vote for Hamas was more a protest against Fatah's governance record than a vote of support for Hamas's political agenda. We continue to believe that the Palestinian people support the policies of President Abbas, whom they also elected on a platform of peace just over a year ago. President Abbas has made clear in his speech on February 18 that he expects the future government to accept previous agreements and obligations between the parties and adhere to a negotiating process with Israel aimed at a two-state solution. The challenge we face in the coming months is to continue to demonstrate to the Palestinian people that their interests and aspirations are best served by supporting those who share a vision of the path of peace, It will be important for us to maintain contact with and support to moderate Palestinian voices. Democracy is a right, but elected officials must act with responsibility and accept the consequences of their decisions. Elections do not wash away all sins. Hamas was responsible for dozens of suicide bombings in the past decade, and by its own statement, the current calm is only a tactical lull. It is up to Hamas to embrace change, to better pursue achievement of the desires of the Palestinian people, to live in peace, or to take responsibility for the consequences of its failure to do so. You cannot deliver a peaceful and better life for your people if you're not committed to peace. Thank you very much, and after my colleagues speak, we'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Kunder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo David's comments and appreciation for your statement, Mr. Lantos and Ms. Watson and others, about the staff who were killed in Pakistan. I was just on the phone with our aid mission director there. Many of those folks are working around the clock right now to do earthquake relief, and so they will very much appreciate the thoughts of the Congress, and I will certainly pass those on. Especially appreciate your mentioning Mr. Ahmed, the local employee who was killed, because we do have very, very many dedicated Pakistani and other employees around the world as part of our embassy teams. I would just summarize very briefly my statement, and three main points I tried to make in the statement. Number one, I was asked by the committee explicitly to talk about the humanitarian situation in the West Bank and Gaza, and as the chairman mentioned and as other members mentioned, the situation has deteriorated significantly in the last 4 years, both in terms of per capita income, in terms of health indicators of the general population, including children, in terms of the amount of disposable income that Palestinians have available, in terms of nutritional status. Because of the Intifada and the related closures, the overall humanitarian situation in the West Bank has become dramatically worse in the last 4 years. For example, in the Gaza Strip, unemployment now exceeds 50%, which is obviously a contribution to some of the political attitudes in the region. The second point I made, and just to back up what David said, I want to, because there's been a lot of comments this morning so far about aid to Hamas, I want to make it very clear that we take very seriously our responsibility as defined by the Congress to oversee the U.S. taxpayers' dollars. While we are not perfect, we are making every effort to ensure that not one single dollar of taxpayers' money goes to Hamas or to any other foreign terrorist organization. We have in place a multi-layered system to vet the individuals and organizations who receive assistance from the U.S. government, to require a certification from every organization we work with, to have a detailed set of audits by our Inspector General on how we spend the money, and to the extent possible under the security circumstances that prevail on the ground, to get Americans or our Foreign Service employees out to look at the projects, lay eyes on the projects, to make sure that the dollars are being spent for what they're intended to be spent for. The system is not perfect. We are striving for 100% perfection, but it is a very carefully monitored system to ensure that not a single dollar goes to Hamas as an organization or any of its representatives. And as David said, we will continue to try to make that system as foolproof and as tight as possible. The third point I wanted to make is just to go over very briefly with the committee, and this is the slide, the one slide I presented here of the pie chart, to give a quick overview of exactly what the U.S. Foreign Assistance Program in the territories consists of right now. And it is because of our strong U.S. government support for the peace process and for Gaza disengagement. It is a multifaceted program. Starting in the upper right quadrant from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock, about 14% of the foreign assistance goes to economic growth. This is micro-enterprise loans to Palestinian women. It is support for the Palestinian Marble Association, a private sector business group, to increase marble exports and job creation in the West Bank. It is those kind of economic activities. The pink democracy and governance slide, about 8% of U.S. foreign assistance goes for helping run the elections. to help create an independent Supreme Court in the Palestinian territories, to support municipal governments as opposed from the Palestinian Authority itself, and to support civil society organizations, lawyers' associations, women's associations, and so forth, to create an effective voice for the Palestinian people to lobby their own government. About 7% of the money, the yellow, goes for health care in the territories. About 8% goes for education, and this includes building local schools. It includes scholarship programs for Palestinian youth to attend school in the U.S. and also to attend Palestinian universities focused on the poorest and most isolated parts of the population. About 29% goes for water and other infrastructure projects. Obviously, water, that is to say the supply of drinking water and the treatment of wastewater, is a critical issue in that water-deprived part of the world. The water aquifers obviously do not respect the boundaries between the West Bank and Israel or Gaza and Israel, so these interventions benefit the Israelis as well in terms of water supply and water purity. And obviously the water conditions are directly related to the health care conditions in the territories. Continuing from 7 to 10 o'clock, the border crossings. About 15% of our foreign assistance program is the congressionally mandated purchase of scanning equipment for the border crossings, both to increase the exports from the territories, most of which go to Israel, and to increase Israeli security. So about 15% is the purchase of American-made security equipment at the border crossings. And finally, the last quadrant, the financial assistance, is what Ambassador Welsh talked about earlier. About 19% of our assistance up to this point has been in the form of cash transfers, obviously discussed with the Congress, to the Palestinian Authority, and it is that money that has been requested back from the Palestinian Authority, and we have, as the ambassador just testified, an agreement by the Palestinian Authority to return the great bulk of that money. So the picture I want to paint for you is that we have a multivaried foreign assistance program in the territories. Much of it is humanitarian in nature, directly benefiting health and water. Others is to reach out to moderate elements like business groups, lawyers, associations, and so forth within the Palestinian community. All of this is done under the very careful vetting procedures I described earlier. With that, Mr. Chairman, I conclude my testimony. I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Dayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee today. I'm just going to highlight a few things that appear in my statement, so I hope everyone had a chance to take a look at it. Let me start off by saying that it's quite clear that the seismic shift in Palestinian politics produced by the January elections will have profound consequences for the security sector. But I would tell you I think it's still too early to know exactly how those will play out. What we do know, of course, is that prior to the elections, the performance of the Palestinian security forces was disappointing in almost every respect, in confronting terrorists, in collecting weapons, and in consolidating and right-sizing their forces. And this ineffectiveness of the Palestinian security forces led the Israelis to conduct unilateral actions in their own defense. There were a few bright spots. There was good cooperation between the Palestinian security forces and the Israeli defense forces on Gaza disengagement. This good cooperation also occurred during the Palestinian elections, and there is pretty good daily cooperation between the IDF and the Palestinian security forces on the ground in the West Bank today. I would also note that the predicted internal violence during and post the Palestinian elections did not occur. Nevertheless, the current U.S. support to the Palestinian security forces is clearly under review. The Hamas election victory complicates the future efforts at Palestinian security sector reform. It is well-established policy that the United States will have no contact with Hamas or any security agency controlled by Hamas. And I'm quite well aware of that policy, and I am in total support of that policy. Nevertheless, we have to also keep in mind that security sector reform is the foundation upon which any long-term success in the Palestinian area will be built. The majority of Palestinians and Israelis want peace, and as I said, Palestinian security reform is central to carrying out that process. As a result, my team, which is a relatively small international team, hopes to continue its mission of monitoring and advising on Palestinian-Israeli security coordination and, if it turns out to be possible, on Palestinian security forces reform. Nevertheless, we're currently at a crossroads where the Palestinians themselves will have to either move forward on disarmament and security consolidation or face confrontation and potential chaos. Let me note in closing that I am convinced that only the United States can lead the effort for Palestinian security reform. I worked hard in the past weeks to establish credibility with Israelis, Palestinians, Quartet members, and the international donor community. My team has the outlines of a campaign plan to guide our efforts. But we must have a capable partner committed to peace. Hamas's failure to accept the principles so far established by the Quartet will halt any ability we have to make progress, and decisions made by a Hamas-run Palestinian Authority government may very well derail our efforts. But while we must now clearly wait and see how the situation ultimately unfolds, I would encourage all of us to be cautious before we rush to the conclusion that the effort is simply not worth it. As I said earlier, security sector reform remains fundamental to achieving a Palestinian state at peace with its neighbors and responsive to the needs of its people at home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, General. We now go to the 5-minute rule, and Mr. Lantos is first.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend all three of our distinguished witnesses. I have some very simple and specific questions, gentlemen. General Dayton, I would be grateful, as I know my colleagues would, if you would tell us what has been the flow of weapons into Gaza following the Israeli withdrawal from there. I particularly want to ask you to comment on what happened during the tribal violence on the Rafah border early in January and during the Khartoum disaster, during which, as I understand it, French and Danish contingents did not perform their responsibilities. And I would like to ask you what weaponry has been smuggled into Gaza and from Gaza to the West Bank. If I may turn to Mr. Kunder, you have indicated repeatedly, and I commend you, that no dollars have gone or will go to Hamas as an organization. The question is no longer that. The question is, as Hamas takes over the Palestinian Authority, as long as Hamas is in control, the legislation that Ms. Ross-Lehtinen and I are sponsoring insists that no dollars go to the Palestinian Authority controlled by this terrorist organization, except food, medication, and water. And finally, Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to ask you to comment on the Ross-Lehtinen and Lantos legislation. We intend to move on this expeditiously. We would like to work with the administration, and we very much hope that the administration will not paint itself into a corner such as it did on the port controversy. It was an embarrassing spectacle yesterday watching you and three of your distinguished colleagues deal with a situation that simply was beyond your capability to deal with, because the position you were defending was an unacceptable position. General Dayton.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me try to be fairly brief. First of all, on the flow of weapons into Gaza. It's certainly an area that has us concerned. We have talked with both the Egyptians and the Israelis for their assessment of how this is going. The Israelis have given us some information which we have shared with the others who control the border, and the Israelis, I think, are more comfortable now than they have been, but they're still very concerned. and it's an area that I will discuss personally when I go to Egypt next week with the appropriate Egyptian authorities. I'm more concerned, however, on Rafah because my view of what's happening in Rafah may not be quite what your view is. I would tell you that we have processes in place at Rafah to make it stronger. We have a procedure in place. As a matter of fact, on the 9th of March, I will chair a council that will include Israelis, Palestinians, and Egyptians to refine our procedures at the border. But I do have to tell you that the European Union monitors are actually doing a pretty good job. Even my Israeli colleagues would tell you that they're not doing as badly as they are kind of being reported as doing. They're doing a pretty good job, and that the Danes and the French, first of all, they only have 2 or 3 members of those countries present. I spoke to both of these individuals after the cartoon controversy. Sir, they stayed on their jobs. They did not flee. They did not go anywhere. And the European monitors are doing, I think, as I said, a satisfactory job. General Pistolesi, the Italian Carabinieri chief down there, and I are in constant communication. And Rafah may actually be something that in the future we will look at and say, we worked this out pretty well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I completely agree with Mr. Lantos. I completely agree with what you just said. I was exactly trying to draw that distinction that the issue is now what we're going to do vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority. Ambassador Welsh is leading the interagency discussion on that, in which we're participating, so I think I would turn to him for further clarification.
Congressman Lantos, thank you. First, with respect to the question that you directed to me, we, of course, would welcome working with you, sir, and other members of the committee on any legislative approach, including the one that is in draft now, to address these issues. As you know, I'm available at any time to work on this or any other matter in your purview. Sir, as Jim Kunder just mentioned, traditionally, we have not provided much direct support to the Palestinian Authority, the government per se. We, several days ago, as Secretary Rice announced here at the Congress, we asked the Palestinian Authority to return to us whatever was left unexpended of the direct assistance that had been provided in the past. There are 2 tranches of that which where there are dollars remaining, Mr. Lantos. One is from some years ago. There is about, I think it's $75,000 left. And the other amount is much more considerable, near $50 million, which was provided in support of Gaza disengagement last year in order to better the conditions in Gaza. The bulk of that money is unexpended. We asked for it back, and we've been talking to the Palestinian Authority about the delivery of that money back to us. Yesterday we received the $76,000 returned, and 2/3 of the remaining amount, $30 million, was also returned to us yesterday. We are talking with them about the schedule for the return of the remainder. I expect to accomplish that, Mr. Lantos, before a new government takes over. So, as far as direct assistance to the Palestinian Authority government per se, there should be, by the time this interim caretaker government leaves office, no U.S. taxpayer dollars in their hands. The amounts may differ from what we contributed because, of course, some money's been spent. Contracts have to be undone. I'm not exactly familiar with that side of the AID business, but that accounts for the difference in the money. In the future, as we undertake this review, as I mentioned to you, it will be according to several principles. We would expect, though I don't have policy decisions yet on this, Mr. Lantos, that there will be 3 consequences for our assistance program, broadly speaking. We will continue assistance in basic humanitarian needs and redirect some of the money that we've taken back for that purpose. Other activities, sir, we are likely to suspend, and there will be some we may well cancel. Again, we have to present, we're going literally line by line through each program activity to establish their validity according to the criteria that I just mentioned. and then make a recommendation to our bosses, and we'll consult with you in that process, sir. As you know, for any redirection of these monies, it does involve notification to Congress, so you would be able to exercise your oversight responsibilities in that regard.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The chair seldom asks a question, but I will ask one now. About 80% of the hospitals and clinics in the Palestinian territories are owned by the state, and a cutoff of humanitarian aid, which seems very likely, will have quite an impact on those hospitals, all of which underscores the importance of Christian missionaries in the territory. And I'm wondering if in your work you see the possibility of unfair treatment of these Christian hospitals and missionaries who, on questions of taxation and mobility, problems of moving around, is there such a problem, and are we doing anything about it?
Mr. Chairman, we're looking at that issue right now because clearly one of the things that we're looking at as part of the interagency review that Ambassador Welsh is leading is what portion of what would normally be considered humanitarian or basic needs like health care is being done through Palestinian Authority supported facilities, what percentage is being done through NGOs, Christian and others, and what percentage is being done through private clinics. We have a pretty good idea of what those numbers are. We're trying to get even greater clarity on which Palestinian patients go to which facilities. But the general question you raise is a critical one, because if at the end of this we want to provide medical care as part of the humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, we will have to address the fact that some significant portion, certainly more than 50%, do get basic care from government-run health clinics, and they tend to be the poorest of the Palestinian people. There are many factors that determine whether Palestinians can access adequate health care, including mobility within the West Bank. We do not believe at this point that any prejudice against Christian organizations per se is a major factor. We're looking at that as well, and we'll be glad to get back to the committee with more information.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And I want to echo the Chairman's statement with regards to those organizations. I think they do a tremendous service to Palestinians. And, you know, while we have severe, I do at least, and I know you do as well, disagreements with Hamas, vulnerable women and children certainly need health care, and certainly these NGOs or PVOs, and many of them are Christian, some of them are not, do provide a valuable service. So the sooner that review can be done, I think the better, so we know how we can beef up those actions so that a benign entity gets it rather than one that has an agenda that includes the destruction of Jews in Israel. Let me also and ask you all, and respond to that further if you'd like. Mr. Kunder, you might want to speak to the issue of UNRWA. And you know that I've spoken about that, and you as well, many times in the past. Hamas had disproportionate influence on UNRWA in the past, especially with regards to the textbooks and the anti-Semitic language contained within those textbooks. Where do we go now with UNRWA going forward? General Dayton, regionally, how is the United States working with friends and allies like Jordan and Egypt? And with the Arab Summit now going to be held in, of all places, Khartoum, Sudan, what is likely to come out of that summit? Do we have any sense vis-a-vis Hamas? Again, Ambassador Welsh, you might want to touch on the issue of the NGOs as well, because these services are vital. And as Mr. Hyde pointed out, we are concerned that there may be a move to unduly and unjustly tax those who are providing these vital services, which would be absolutely counterproductive to the most vulnerable of people in these areas.
First of all, we share your sense of urgency, Congressman Smith. The meeting is going to be held tomorrow morning in Tel Aviv. We've summoned together all of the international, we've invited, I shouldn't say we've summoned, we've invited the international organizations like UNRWA and the UN agencies, the NGOs working in the area and so forth, to get a clearer picture of what everyone is capable of doing as part of this review that Ambassador Welsh is leading. The education issue is one of those that I think it's part of the interagency review that's taking place for the very reasons you stated. As we go through these issues, we're trying to understand where we have been able to have an influence on moderating things like the content of textbooks, and then recognizing the need, as the ambassador said, to send a clear, consistent message to the new Hamas government of non-support. How do we continue to have some influence on issues like textbooks? Because this is the classic case on which we obviously will be consulting extensively with the Congress on engagement versus disengagement. We want to send a clear signal, but these are the kind of issues where we have been able to have some influence in the past. We'll get a better understanding tomorrow of what the NGOs will be able to continue to do on their own, but we will have to grapple with whether we're going to continue to deal with the Ministry of Education itself. Thank you.
Mr. Berman.
Mr. Walsh, I think wanted to, Ambassador Walsh.
Mr. Berman gone?
Mr. Smith, would you like me to answer your question
Please,
about...
if Chairman submitted, still got time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. You'd asked, sir, about the Arab League summit in Khartoum. Let me take that opportunity not only to answer that, but broaden it a little bit to speak about our overall diplomatic approach to this issue, which has been quite complex and vigorous in last weeks. First, there's no Hamas government formed yet, so I don't know exactly what issues might be on the table for the members of the Arab League to look at their meeting in Khartoum. But I would expect that there's going to be discussion. Our approach to that or any other international event, for example, an invitation to Hamas representatives by a foreign government, or even if we hear of such an invitation that might be happening, we have already gone out worldwide to inform our embassies of what our approach and position is. First, on contacts with Hamas. As you know, of course, we consider Hamas a terrorist organization, but our laws are not replicated by other countries. Nevertheless, we urge them against contact, because in our view, isolation and pressure ought to be the words of the moment. Second, if they nonetheless want to have such contacts for whatever reasons that they think, we bring to their attention the quartet principles, the three things that we've all enumerated here, and explain the logic of those, their self-evident nature, so that whoever is meeting with these people will try and impress upon them their responsibilities. Again, we don't answer for foreign governments, but in terms of communicating our position, it's very forthright. That will also be done, it already has been done with Arab League members individually. This was a centerpiece of Secretary Rice's trip to several of the Arab League countries just in recent days. But before the summit itself, we'll go back again to each one of these countries and make sure that we're up to date with our position. In terms of the NGO community and its concerns, both mentioned by the Chairman and yourself, sir, we're very attentive to the interests of the PVOs and NGOs in trying to do their job and help people at risk. This is a complicated subject for them, too. You know, they want to spend privately raised money in a responsible way, I'm sure. We've had a number of meetings with them. We're going to continue that process because they have some concerns that are particular to their work. It's a bit different than government work. Finally, we have been involved in, and we are continuing as we speak, and one of the reasons Ambassador Mark Ott is here in Washington today is we're also talking with other foreign governments in the European Union about how we implement the next phase of the quartet's conditions. That is, once there is a Hamas-led government, what do we then do? As I said in my prepared remarks, we would like other governments to take a look at our example and our leadership and perhaps emulate some of our practices. Again, the purpose being to get these people to agree to those three conditions, and if they don't, to make their ability to function as a government enormously difficult.
Sir, Mr. Chairman, Mr. King had asked me a question too. Would you like me to answer it or pass?
Absolutely.
Okay, very quickly. I can be very brief. Congressman, I appreciate the question because it's an important one. I and my team are in close contact with the Egyptians and the Jordanians and others in the region. The Egyptians in particular have been playing a very vital role. Not only did they facilitate the Cairo agreement last March, which led to the calm among the various factions, but on the ground, the Egyptians have worked very intensively with Palestinian Authority security forces in Gaza under very hazardous conditions, I must tell you, to try to reshape the security sector and maintain law and order. And, of course, more recently, the Egyptians have been in the lead in trying to press Hamas to change its policies. As you know, the Secretary and Mr. Welch recently went to Cairo and Riyadh. I've been to Cairo already. I'm going back again next week. And before the end of the month, I will travel to Jordan as well. So thank you, sir.
Now, Mr. Berman, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask three questions. I'd appreciate it if you could sort of allot the time so that all three could at least get a response. First, Ambassador Welch, you briefly touched on your desire to, even after a Hamas government is seated, continue dialogue and activity with the president of the Palestinian Authority, who you appropriately referred to as a man who has spoken on behalf of peace. He has laid out at different times, some conditions for the new government. But once this government is seated, and even the conditions that he's spoken about haven't been met, and even though he has not taken control of all the security forces, I'd like you to defend the logic of continuing dialogues, discussions, and work with the office of the President of the Palestinian Authority versus the impression that I think a lot of people would have that, in effect, we're recognizing the existence of a two-headed government that undercuts this effort to pressure Hamas to agree to the three conditions that have been laid out. Secondly, I'd like to ask, just to clarify what may have been an impression here, that the European Union has decided to give financial assistance to a Hamas-led government. That wasn't my understanding. I'm wondering if you could, are we off going in different directions in the EU on this already? Your comments would indicate that you don't think so, so I'd like to just clarify this issue of what that announcement of assistance was. And third, Mr. Kunder particularly, given that our AID employees can't go into Gaza, that there are many parts of the West Bank we don't let them to go into, realistically, once a Hamas government is seated, what are these layers of review and auditing and controls that keep things from becoming essentially humanitarian programs controlled by Hamas, diverted to Hamas? You don't have the kind of access to the on-the-ground help that seems to be an integral part of conducting that review. How do you do it?
Mr. Berman, sir, let me take a stab at your first two questions. With respect to our position vis-à-vis the Office of the President and the person of President Mahmoud Abbas, our policy decision, and agreed with the Quartet, is clear. We intend to maintain contact with the interim government under his leadership until a new government takes charge. We don't know yet when that will happen, and we don't know who will be in it. The logic of dialogue with the President of the Palestinian Authority is He presents a position of sharp contrast with those who have been elected in the PLC. That was evident in the speech he made. It has been evident in his positions that he articulated when he ran for president. On the basis of those positions, he's been invited here to the United States twice. We think he represents an intention to pursue a negotiated peace based on a two-state solution, to do so in an atmosphere free of violence and terror. And he certainly is building on the agreements that were previously agreed. So our intent is to have this dialogue with him. Now, that does not translate into any decision at this point on any support to the office of the President. I want to be very clear about that. As I said earlier, our support to the Palestinian Authority government has been on an exceptional basis, and we intend to have all of that returned by the time an interim government takes over. On the
By the time a permanent
Chair-
government takes
That's correct.
The chair interrupts to note a vote is on, so we will stand in recess until after the vote and then return and finish.
Can we just
the
hear
hearing.
the last answers of this witness to my
I
question?
can't hear you. What?
Can we just, could Ambassador Welsh and Mr. Kunder just answer the rest of my questions, and then I'll be out of your hair?
You can stay here as long
Okay,
as you want.
I'm good.
I'll try and be brief on the European Union provision of assistance. My understanding is that they have announced a release of some money from the World Bank Trust Fund, some money to pay utilities and fuel, and some money to be redirected towards UNRWA. This is not to support the next government, but rather is to support the interim government or assistance that is redirected. Knowing the budget needs of the current interim government, Mr. Berman, I expect that these monies will be necessary to pay their salary bill in the current month. And especially since it appears highly unlikely the Israeli government will return tax revenues to the Palestinian Authority in this current period. So I think while I haven't had the chance to go through each item with Mr. Ott yet, and I expect to do so tomorrow, I see this as consistent with the Quartet's decision to support the interim government, sir.
Sir, I don't want to pretend that it's easy, as it is some other places. It's very hard to exert oversight, and so we try to put extra layers in there. Number one, just to reiterate the basic fact, I mean, most of the money that is, most of the U.S. taxpayers' dollars money is going to either U.S. contractors or United States NGOs. So we're dealing with organizations we know them, we know their auditing system. Second, we try to get our staff out as much as possible. They can't get into the Gaza Strip right now, but they do get out and lay eyes on these American, U.S. Foreign Service employees as much as possible in the West Bank. Third, we use our Foreign Service nationals, most of whom obviously speak Arabic, to get into the Gaza Strip and lay eyes on the project and report back to us, including photographs and so forth. Fourth, we use the American contractors to check on other projects, so we get yet another layer. Fifth, we've developed a MIS GIS system. We're actually talking about satellite imagery and so forth to check on all this. And then sixth, we've got a very extensive auditing system and follow-up to double-check normal auditing procedures. Now, is that as good as me going out and looking at it myself? No, sir, I wouldn't pretend that it is. But it is we believe that we have very good validity on how those tax dollars are being spent and that they're getting to the ultimate end users.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The committee stands in recess. We'll be back as soon as we can. Resume its hearing, and I'd like to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Iowa, Chairman Leach.
At any point in time, timing is sometimes as important as substance. And a year or so ago, when the new Secretary of State came for the first time before our committee and talking about the Middle East, I mentioned some concerns about the issue of mortality, and I suggested that we had what appeared to be two credible leaders to potentially reach some sort of accommodation between the parties and Mr. Abbas and Prime Minister Sharon. But if one took a bet on whether both would be alive in 2 or 3 years, it would have been a bet not many people would take. And I raise this from the perspective of this circumstance. It's new. We no longer have Mr. Sharon in power. We now have Hamas, in what appears to be the driver's seat. And so one of the great questions is one of timing. And do we have the luxury of affording to respond to a lot of ideology we don't like with some turnoffs of our own? And I raise this in this sense. There have been calls on this committee today not to have any discourse with Hamas, not to have any diplomatic contacts. And I want to tell you, I can think of nothing that seems to me to more ill-fit the times. It's one thing to disagree with everything that Hamas stands for in terms of the apparent desire to eliminate Israel. It's another thing not to talk with our people we differ with. And simply from a timing sense, it strikes me that to refuse to engage is one of the great mistakes of our time. Would you care to comment on that circumstance, Ambassador Welsh?
Thank you, Congressman Leach. I agree with you, sir. When I took my responsibilities a year ago or so, I never predicted the sort of sweeping leadership changes we've seen, not just in this particular place, but elsewhere in the Middle East. In that year, for example, we've had 2 elections in Egypt, 2 in the Palestinian territories, 3 in Iraq, and 1 in Lebanon. These are dramatic times in this particular area. And the array of political forces out there does include some actors with which our discourse is very, very limited, not just non-state actors like Hamas, but also countries like Iran. In the case of Hamas, in addition to the policy differences that we have that shape our approach, which is one which essentially is speaking from a distance about what our requirements are as a nation and as part of the international community for this organization, there are also significant legal impediments. We operate naturally and abide by, according to American law, which, since Hamas is designated as a foreign terrorist organization under American law, were I to have a conversation with any member of Hamas or any official of Hamas, I would be breaching the law. So I can't do it, even if I wanted to. And then the situation for policy reasons is that we've elected not to. To discuss the alternatives, I think in that sense become pretty narrow and constricted discussion with respect to Hamas. I think when they assume the responsibilities of government, and I'm assuming they will take over the Palestinian government, they will feel some need to respond to the international community's requirements, and they may increase their own communication outwards. In terms of the position of the United States, I think we are not isolated in what we're saying are those requirements. We enjoy good international support for the 3 principles that we've laid out and enshrined in the Quartet statement of January 30th. I believe that those are increasingly self-evident to many, many members of the international community, including some Arab states. So I think this is more a problem of Hamas's isolation by virtue of their lack of response to these concerns rather than our own, sir.
Well, that could be. But once they become the government of what in effect is a non-state, they take on certain aspects that also relate to American history. And Jefferson himself talked about we have relations with people with whom we differ. We had relations with Joseph Stalin, one of the great terrorists in the history of man. We formed what was probably the greatest alliance in the history of the world, the U.S.-Soviet alliance to defeat fascism.
if we're going to achieve peace, don't we have to talk to people that control the levers of decision-making for that prospect? Do we press Hamas into only discourse with Iran, only discourse with parties we don't appreciate, or do we want to move in a new direction? It may take a change in legislation, but as much as one might be appalled with the positions of someone, not to discourse with them strikes me as a bit awkward for a great nation state.
Well, Mr. Leach, I think the first part of your question was, in some respects, the part that we ought to pay more attention to. That is the condition that if we are to achieve peace, if we're going to make that effort, then I think the onus should be on the other side, the other party, whoever it is, Hamas or any other party, to accept what is commonly understood to be the path of peace, for peace in this conflict. Now, if they can prove that they are intent upon achieving peace by the standards that everybody has seen as appropriate for this struggle, then I'm sure they'll have an audience. Until then, I think the responsibility of a great nation is not to demean itself simply for the purpose of the discourse. I think in saying that, too, I can be confident I'm not going to have any lack of understanding of what their attitudes or positions will be. I'm sure there will be lots of people beating a path to our door or to communicate those, and lots of people announcing things in public. But the thing that we expect them to announce is whether they agree with what it is everybody else has agreed to. Under those circumstances, then we can evaluate whether it's appropriate to change our position.
Well, I hope that tactic works, and there are a lot of reasons to be sympathetic to some of the underlying reasons for it. I don't know a lot of instances in the history of man that refusal to have discussions with another side has led to agreements that are workable. But if we can come up with something novel in the history of man, I would welcome that tremendously. Good luck.
Just to conclude, I probably should have indicated earlier, this approach does have the benefit of some experience. It's not unlike the approach that we took with respect to the PLO over the years.
And we had certain discussions with the PLO at given points in time. It's also not unlike the position we've taken with Fidel Castro, although we have certain discourse with his government that we're not having with this one. And the Castro model, while understandable, is not a model that many people would suggest has been successful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for very excellent testimony. And I also want to publicly thank the administration for its strong support and principled support on this issue. Condoleezza Rice was at our committee last week and also was very firm in saying that we will not deal with a terrorist organization like Hamas. So there should be no mistake. I thought it would be helpful if I would to quickly read into the record a part of what the Hamas Charter says, because I think it speaks for itself. It's a wonderful document, amazing document. Wonderful is the wrong word. It's amazing for its clarity and for its message. Throughout the document, Israel is constantly attacked, and Jews are attacked and blamed for everything bad that has ever happened in the world. It's really just astounding. Jews are responsible for the Freemasons, Rotary clubs, Lions clubs. They're to be blamed for World War I, World War II, the League of Nations, and the United Nations. And so let me just read a couple of paragraphs in the Hamas Charter, and I'm quoting. It says clearly, quote, The prophet, prayer and peace be upon him, said, "The time will not come until Muslims will fight the Jews and kill them, until the Jews hide behind rocks and trees, which will cry, 'O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come on and kill him.'" It also says, and I quote, "Peace initiatives, the so-called peaceful solutions, and the international conferences to resolve the Palestinian problem are all contrary to the beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement. For renouncing any part of Palestine means renouncing part of the religion." So I just, think this needs to be said, because there's no doubt in my mind that Hamas cannot be appeased and should not be legitimatized by the international community. The ball is clearly in their court. They know what they have to do in order to have discussions and negotiations. They need to abide by all previous agreements signed by the Palestinians. They need to recognize the right of Israel to exist as an independent Jewish state, and they need to renounce terrorism. It's as clear as that. And if they do that, we'll be happy to speak with them. I want to also, Mr. Smith before, talk about some of the other countries, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that can play an important role, but really cannot have it both ways. In 2000, 2001, when Yasser Arafat rejected a peace agreement with Israel, where he could have had 100% of Gaza back, 97% of the West Bank, a state of his own, billions of dollars of international aid, a Palestinian state, he rejected it. And I felt at that time that countries like Egypt and other countries did not put enough pressure on him, did not hold his hand and say, if you take this plunge, we will be with you every step of the way. I think that these countries that get billions of dollars of aid from the United States really need to not be allowed to have it both ways. They really need to tell Hamas that this is unacceptable. Let me just ask a couple of questions. With a majority in the PLC and control of various ministries held by Hamas, how can we deal? I guess this would be Mr. Kunda. How could we deal with the security forces of a governing authority that's controlled by a terrorist organization? And let me also say, I mentioned before that I met with Mr. Abbas in Ramallah. How could he serve as any kind of counterweight to Hamas, given, frankly, how little he was willing to do when he was fully in control? We urged him, get out there and campaign, get out there and tell your people that a Hamas government would be a disaster, and yet he was unwilling to do that. So how can he serve as any kind of counterweight to Hamas?
Did you want General Dayton to answer the question about the security forces, sir? We really don't have any contact with the security forces.
Well, anyone who'd care to answer would be fine.
I'll take that, Congressman, just as a very narrow one.
I'm sorry, and let me just add, is there any doubt that unless Hamas or the Palestinians dismantle the terrorist infrastructure and go after the terrorists and disarm these independent militias, that it's impossible to have any kind of peace? And how can we expect Hamas to do that when they're part of the problem?
Well, very quickly on the first question you asked, which was basically, can we work with the security forces under a Hamas government? I would have to tell you the answer is no, we cannot. Simple. That's straightforward. Now, are there other options? I don't think so. I think the answer is very straightforward. It goes to the heart, though, of the issue, which is if you don't get the security sector fixed, you're not going to fix anything else. So that's going to be a problem that we're going to have to deal with.
Ms. Berkeley? Ambassador Welch, I'm just wondering if you had a comment on that, including Mr. Abbas and the other Arab countries. Because let me just say, my problem is that down the line we already see the Russians talking to Hamas, the Europeans sending humanitarian money. There's lots of ways. Are we going to create legal? Are we going to be firm? Or will we start creating legal fictions where we'll isolate specific Hamas figures in the Palestinian Authority, but we'll continue to deal with the PA in general, under the guise of humanitarian aid? That's my big fear, that down the line we sort of finesse it a little bit, and Hamas has its cake and can eat it as well.
Time of the gentleman has expired, but Ambassador Welch, if you want to respond, of course, please do.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Congressman Engel, I hope we've conveyed to you today with conviction that we intend to be firm behind the principles that we set out. As you know, we built a pretty strong base of international support for those, especially using the quartet mechanism, which has proved uniquely valuable because it brings in the United Nations and the EU, and yes, Russia. That's America's position, and we intend to hold to it, sir. With respect to the positions of other Arab countries, Egypt and Saudi Arabia you mentioned, but there are also others whose views are relevant in this regard. I think so far we don't detect any automatic homogeneity in those positions. For example, Egypt has met with Hamas representatives, including recently, but also going back some time in order to forge a period of quiet, whereas Saudi Arabia has not yet. Some other Arab states have met with him, some have not. I think until the Hamas government forms itself and begins to make its view more clear on what the international community expects of it, it would be premature to react to what those individual Arab countries are saying and doing about this. With respect to the position of the President of the Palestinian Authority, I think you heard my earlier answer on this, sir. We do think this is a man with whom we can work, and he has an important role under the basic law of the Palestinian Authority. He has important constitutional responsibilities which carry forward, and he has subscribed to the agreements that are on record, including the roadmap, which, yes, sir, does call for the dismantlement of terrorist organizations. I think as General Dayton mentioned in his prepared remarks, Mr. Engel, that we all recognize that's going to be an even tougher challenge than it was before when and if there's a Hamas-led government in power. I don't know how they will apportion the security responsibilities. That remains a subject to be decided, but my expectation is that when Hamas is in government, they're going to have the security responsibilities. I don't know what their position will be on the requirements of the roadmap, but our expectation won't change. That is, that all these militias and terror organizations should be dismantled, including Hamas.
Ms. Berkeley?
Thank you, Mr. Smith, and thank you, gentlemen. And Ambassador Welch, I think you sound like I feel right now, so I'm sorry for us both. I know that you gentlemen are working very hard and have a very challenging job, but I can tell you, sometimes I sit up here and I think I'm living in a parallel universe, and I wonder myself, as a member of the International Relations Committee and the Middle East Subcommittee, exactly what our foreign policy is in this country when it comes to the Middle East and what's happening there. I was a tremendous proponent, long before I came to Congress, of the peace process. And it became painfully apparent to me when Yasser Arafat walked away from Camp David that this had nothing to do with a Palestinian state. If Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian leadership had wanted a Palestinian state for the Palestinian people, they would have one now. This is about the destruction of the state of Israel. And I have a number of questions regarding our policy and where we go from here, and what difference does it make when Mr. Kunder, when you spoke, you mentioned in the last 4 years there's been tremendous deterioration on the West Bank. Well, for 3 of those 4 years, Yasser Arafat was in control of the Palestinian Authority, and through his hands went millions and millions and millions of dollars from the international community that money to be used to improve the lives of the Palestinian people. Now, it's apparent that the money was not used, and we have a limited idea of where the money went, although I suspect if we found Yasser Arafat's widow, we could find out where at least some of the money went. And then the last year of the 4 years, Abu Mazen was president of the Palestinian Authority. And to say that I've been less than inspired by his leadership would be a gross understatement. As Congressman Engel said, I also met with Abu Mazen, and I was in the Gaza with him, and talked to him about his unique role and opportunity to truly bring peace to a very troubled region in this world, to bring a lasting peace between the Palestinian people and the Jewish state of Israel. And he did little, if anything, to move forward. So the fact that Hamas is there now is a big surprise to anybody. It's certainly not a surprise to me. And I'm beginning to get a little worried that we all think Fatah was such a bargain, where, from my vantage, Fatah did little, if anything, to move the peace process forward. Because, as I said before, in this last year, Abu Mazen had a wonderful opportunity to negotiate a serious and lasting peace with the Israeli people. He chose not to, whether he didn't want to, or didn't have the strength to, or was afraid to. I don't know what it is. But I'd like to know, one question is do you see a big difference in not what's in the charter of Hamas, but what they're going to do that's really any different than Fatah did? That's number one. Number two, when Condi Rice was standing with the Saudi representative a couple of weeks ago after she left Egypt, and Egypt rejected America's request not to fund Hamas, the Saudis said to her that the difference between direct aid and humanitarian aid was a difference without a distinction. That summed it up pretty well to me. And I don't often quote the Saudis, and I'm not a fan, but I think they hit the nail on the head. What is the difference between giving humanitarian aid and aid directly to the Palestinians if it's not getting to the Palestinian people and having the effect of bringing them to the peace table? Number three, when do we expect the Palestinians the Palestinian people to have an expectation of their government to provide the basic services that the Palestinian people need to move forward and improve the quality of their lives? I mean, according to the Hamas charter, we know that the Jews in Israel are to blame for everything that ever happened in this world. But the reality is it's the Palestinian leadership who has done such a terrible disservice to the Palestinian people. And it would seem to me, if we withdrew our support and they had no other avenues, they might look to where they should be looking and should have been looking all these years, and that's to their own leadership to provide the necessities of life so that the Palestinian people can move forward. And I'd love to get your opinion on that. But I fear that until we do a little tough love here and make the Palestinian people accountable for their own decisions and their own future, that we're going to be doing this for the rest of our lives, and there will never be peace in that region. So if I could ask you to respond to any and all of those, my stream of consciousness, I'd appreciate it, because frankly, I don't know where our policy is going.
Well, I'll take a stab at trying to answer some of these questions, Ms. Berkeley. But I agree with the theme of what you're saying. This is an enormously complicated and difficult issue. There are days when I go to the office and think I'm also living in a parallel universe. And there are definitely days when we look at these things and realize that the challenges are more enormous that day than they were the day before. January 26th was one of those days. Last year, the first year of President Mahmoud Abbas's presidency was a year dominated by preparation for and achievement of a peaceful Gaza disengagement. We've sort of forgotten that important contribution that Ariel Sharon gave to securing Israel. And it's important to go back and look at that and recognize that was accomplished and successfully.
Well, I think that's to credit of Ariel Sharon, not necessarily Abu Mazen.
Well, I agree it was initiated by the Israeli Prime Minister, and it was thanks to his leadership that it was carried through. But it could not have been accomplished peaceably without the cooperation of the Palestinian Authority under President Mahmoud Abbas's leadership. I think we all are critical of the lack of performance of the Palestinian Authority in any number of areas, and most of all their voters. And their voters have gone and rewarded an opposition party and kicked out the bums who didn't satisfy them before. With respect to statements that you may have noted during the Secretary's visit to the Middle East with respect to future assistance, I think we just need to take a pause here, Ms. Berkeley, until we see what sort of Hamas government we're dealing with, and then what kinds of reactions there are from the international community. Our discussions with the Saudi and other governments in that area gave us a good opportunity to lay out our concerns, to hear from them about theirs. One prominent concern they do have is not to make the Palestinian people victims of either their own poor leadership, previous or present, and to continue to provide them with humanitarian assistance. I think, and this gets to your third point, why not withdraw our support? Because I think, frankly, I believe many members of this committee and certainly the administration share an interest in responding to the real humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. How to do that is a valid area of discussion. We're going through that discussion right now ourselves and with others, and of course we've been talking about it today. Again, we don't have all the answers, but I think it would be an inappropriate answer to say no, we shouldn't give anything at all to the Palestinian people. I would hope that this committee would agree when we come forward with ideas in this area that they're responsible and worth taking a look at.
Mr. Delahunt.
Can I just ask one more quickie question? Oh, 1 more minute.
How about for the record?
Can I ask the question?
Okay.
Thank you.
Just make it very brief.
All right. I often think what the world would be like if there was peace and a Palestinian state living side by side with an Israeli and a Jewish state of Israel. Imagine the economic opportunity for the Palestinian people and the suffering that would be alleviated if they could partner with the Israelis instead of vowing to destroy them and send them into the sea. And it would be my hope that our policies, and I understand the desire for humanitarian aid. None of us want to be heartless. But on the other hand, I would hope that the deprivation would ultimately lead to the Palestinians recognizing that the path towards restoration, the path towards a viable Palestinian state, the path towards a decent quality of life for the Palestinian people where they have good schools and good hospitals and good health care and good jobs goes through Israel, where you have two partners that are dedicated to improving and raising the standards of living in that entire region. And together they could do this. Alone, the Palestinians will never be able to. And we can give them aid from now until the cows come home. And until we have a change of thought and philosophy, and they are actually forced to make peace with the Israelis, I fear we are condemning these people to purgatory forever. And my heart goes out to the Palestinian people. I think we have poorly served them. Their leadership has served them. The European Union has served them, and the United Nations has not served these people well.
Mr. Delahunt.
Yet, if I could just have some very brief and succinct answers. General Dayton, there's been reports that al-Qaeda has infiltrated Gaza and the West Bank, and presuming that that is accurate, can you relate to me or your assessment of the relationship between al-Qaeda and Hamas?
The simple answer is I've not seen the intelligence that generated that, so I really can't tell you. It's something that I'll certainly take a look at, and if you'd like, we can get back to you with an answer.
So, but you're not aware of it at this point in time?
I
would suspect if there had been intelligence to that effect, given your role, it would have been brought to your attention.
That's correct. This issue has been brought up several times by several actors. We've pressed them for the intelligence basis for it and, frankly, have not gotten much of a response.
Okay, so we don't know. Very
Correct.
good. My colleague from California, Mr. Sherman, indicated that the United Arab Emirates has been a substantial source of revenue and support for Hamas. Is that accurate, Ambassador?
Mr. Delahunt, to the best of my knowledge, the United Arab Emirates government has no relationship with Hamas. There were a number of things that Mr. Sherman raised, including in a hearing yesterday on the Dubai Ports World issue, which I'd like the opportunity to go back and check point by point.
So, Ambassador, you're telling me that you are unaware of any relationship whatsoever between the United Arab Emirates and Hamas?
Well, I'm not aware of any relationship between the United Arab Emirates government and Hamas. That said, the United Arab Emirates has, 2.5 to 3 million citizens, and I don't.
That's fine. I'll accept that. Let's presume that the Europeans and that this government eliminate all but basic humanitarian assistance to the PA once a Hamas government is formed. Where would they be looking in terms of revenue sources, and what would you anticipate the response from those sources would be?
Well, sir, in the past, the Palestinian government has funded itself from basically 4 different sources: its own domestic revenues, including those returned to it by Israel when they collect taxes and customs.
Okay, that's eliminated because the Israelis aren't going to
That is presently frozen.
Right.
There are some modest domestic revenues they collect themselves.
Okay.
Second, there is international community support, especially from the European Union.
Let's presume that's eliminated.
Let's presume that's suspended. Then there are Arab League contributions.
Do you anticipate that those contributions would continue? And if they would continue, would they be enhanced?
I cannot make a judgment yet on that. The Arab Leagues, the members of the Arab League have had an uneven record at best in delivering on previous pledges.
Well, your early review, I presume you're in the process of making that assessment now.
Well,
what's your gut telling you?
We've gone beyond the assessment, Mr. Delahunt. We're involved in diplomatic efforts to address those funding questions, sir. And my gut tells me that this is going to be a much tougher fundraising exercise for those fellows than they have contemplated so far.
Okay. Now, let's go beyond the
finally, they can raise money, from their own resources, and I imagine they're going to attempt to be very creative in how they do that. The previous Palestinian Authority governments have borrowed a great deal of money.
Mm-hmm. From whom?
From banks, commercial loans.
Okay.
I don't know how successful the new government will be in doing
we
that
heard
sort of thing.
references to both Russia and Turkey. What about China?
Russia has not been a substantial contributor in the past.
Could they be?
Well, potentially any country could be, sir.
What about the Turks?
I don't think the Russians are likely to do so because they have signed up to the Quartet principles. That would seem to me to be in contradiction to those. Turkey, I hadn't looked at that one. They're not an important contributor
China?
in the past. Ditto, they're not an important contributor in the past. I don't.
They have energy needs. They have significant energy requirements.
Correct, but they're not they're not significant participants in the international assistance community overall.
But they might very well have
Again,
a national interest to
potentially
secure
that-
a
that's
favorable reception within the Arab world and access to potential
It's
revenue.
conceivable. But that would be a stark departure from their past practice, Mr. Delahunt. Finally, let me just note that there's a difference between running a service organization and running a government. Running the Palestinian Authority government is to make up for the funding gap, is an over $100 million a month enterprise. That's a lot of money to go collect.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Ms. Delahunt. Let me just ask a couple of questions and go to Mr. Crowley, and then we will have to conclude the hearing. I would ask that without objection a letter from the Catholic bishops, Bishop Thomas Wensky, the Bishop of Orlando, the Chairman of the Committee on International Policy, be made a part of the record. He says in pertinent part that the bishops do not believe it would be wise or just to withhold aid to the Palestinian people at large or to punish them for the possible actions of their political leaders, and makes, I think, a very persuasive case about the importance of ensuring, especially since poverty and unemployment are so high, that NGOs and PVOs be utilized, and makes a very strong, I think, statement along those lines. I would ask you if you could to respond to a letter that the National Interreligious Leadership Initiative for Peace in the Middle East posed in a February 13th letter to President Bush. They had a press conference on the 18th of February, and they had representatives, clergy from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all at the press conference. Cardinal McCarrick made the point that, and I quote, "Things have changed in the Holy Land, but that's all the more reason to stay with the roadmap." The letter, and he goes on to say that they are calling to press for an immediate, comprehensive, and lasting ceasefire, and to appoint an on-the-ground special envoy to manage and monitor negotiations. I wonder if you might respond to that last point, especially the special envoy to manage and monitor negotiations. Is that something that might be appointed by the Bush administration, such a person?
I don't foresee us addressing that idea in the near future, sir. I think the near future is going to be dominated by dealing with the consequences of the Palestinian election and a new government under a group that's a terrorist organization according to American law. Precipitate pursuit of negotiations right now would not seem to be warranted.
Is it something that's under consideration as I mean, there needs to be obviously intermediate and longer term perspectives taken into account here.
Well, we would look at that option if we considered that there was an immediate and viable possibility. For example, last year, the quartet appointed a special envoy for Gaza disengagement, Jim Wolfenson. Pardon me. I think if we came to a judgment either as the United States or as a member of the quartet or in some other way that this was a viable option, we'd look at it.
Mr. Crowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony today. Given the fact that Hamas now has been successful in taking control of the Palestinian Authority through democratic means, I believe the U.S. has been helping, but I want to know what you plan to do in the future in terms of promotion of more moderate voices within the Palestinian Authority. What specific plans do we have, or are there any plans you can speak about?
Well, I will provide part of the answer, sir, and ask Jim Cunder to help me with the rest. Looking forward, this is one of the areas of the aid review that we need to pay particular attention to, because we have had democracy promotion activities in the Palestinian territories as part of our past program. Mr. Cunder can give you a sense of what that consisted of, because, as I said earlier in prepared testimony, this is a pretty diverse program. As we go through this aid review, I mean, a real question comes into our minds about how to continue that element of the program going forward. I think we all believe that it's important to work with a moderate center, and there are there is a civil society that is quite active in the Palestinian territories. And we need to figure out how we relate to that and if assistance is an appropriate way to do it in the future. We haven't decided that, sir.
So, Ambassador Welsh, Congressman, testified earlier about the closeness of the election, how the number of seats that Hamas won did not reflect the underlying vote because of the complexities of the dual voting system there. And I mentioned that we have, in fact, been doing a number of programs over the years, I think quite successfully, to get at exactly the point you're talking about. Within the government, we had been, as the peace process was moving along, working to reform certain ministries so that, for example, the Ministry of Finance, which had been subject to allegations of corruption in the past, now has some accountability systems, accounting systems, budgeting systems, so that we have a clearer picture. That kind of reform had been taking place. Then within the broader society, we've been working with business groups, with civil society groups like lawyers groups and women's groups to bring them into the political system to try to do exactly what you're talking about, to reach out to moderate elements, which we consider to comprise a large portion of the population.
Let me ask another question, and that is, just shifting gears a bit. In terms of what is legal, assuming the United States in some way or some capacity wanted to assist the Palestinian Authority and the people, the Palestinian people, given the changes in law that have taken place since 9/11, the Patriot Act and other laws that have cracked down on money laundering and direct or indirect financing of terrorist organizations, how will that go? How will that actually occur now, if that were to take place? Banking laws, will banks actually conduct the necessary business that needs to take place in order to comply with the law?
Well, Mr. Crowley, I don't have a really good answer to that question because it's a really hard question to answer. Our laws are very strict, and there are a number of them that apply. And they inhibit us completely from dealing with terrorist organizations or providing any material support to terrorist organizations, whether they're in government or out of government. When you try and implement that law and our policy in the Palestinian territories, you run up against some, excuse me, this is going off, sorry. You run up against some difficult questions. This particular poignant question for our NGO and PVO community, who are the providers for most of our assistance. The bulk of our assistance is not done directly by government employees, but we require them to sign certain certifications, I mean, making them, in some extent, legally liable as well. And I think it is something that merited examination and careful vetting in each and every activity, even before this election. So what we started several months ago was to look at the integrity of that vetting process on the part of the U.S. government. And Mr. Kunder can explain a little bit more in detail if you're interested, sir, or we can give you something for the record on this. Because this is particularly when you're not dealing with a government for most of your work. You're dealing with people or organizations. It's often difficult to discern who the heck they are. And we need to be very confident about who it is we work with.
I would be interested in a more possibly detailed, I know time doesn't permit, a more detailed answer on that, because I think my observation is, even if the United States wants to help, I think there are many laws that may prohibit the actual transfer of funds to a known terrorist organization. And I'd be interested, I don't know if Mr. Conner.
Yes, sir, we'll submit something for the record, but I can assure you we had very careful vetting of each organization to the maximum extent possible before we give them any money.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley. Let me just conclude by thanking our extraordinary witnesses for the excellent work you're doing. The committee certainly appreciates that on both sides of the aisle, and I personally want to thank you. You know, at a time when the problems are so elusive, the problems and the solutions are so extraordinarily elusive, you're trying to work this issue and work it 24/7, and I want you to know how much we appreciate that. There will be a number of questions that members who could not return would like to pose. If you could get back to us as quickly as possible, and without objection, they will be made a part of the record as well. The hearing is adjourned, and thank you.